our Sunday service. So any of you who wish to not be involved in the recording, you can blank out your video camera now and just listen as Dr. Patrick O'Neill, our own upcoming president of the Board of Trustees, who was an engineer and a scientist and a worker among the many in Silicon Valley who inhabited a sailboat in the Pacific Ocean. The low-cost labor in this country. I guess slavery would have been low-cost labor to some, but it was high cost to others. Patrick.
Thank you, Mike. And we have some pictures here that we'll be looking at.
I'm not hearing you, Patrick.
We have some pictures here that we will be looking at, so you don't have to look at me.
Good. Yes, I think you need to be close to the microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, it's quiet, but I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, let's get this. You should be seeing the first slide here that says low-cost labor. All right. The original concept of cheap labor was the idea of not paying workers at all. In some ancient civilizations, labor was free except for minimal costs for food and hovels. There were two forms of this depending on the conditions by which the labor was forced. And I'll give you a moment to look at the caption here. And it always amuses me, you see some ancient object like the pyramids, and they talk about this was built by Pharaoh so-and-so or Emperor so-and-so. It wasn't built by them. It was built by the workers that built it. Covey labor is when an underclass of people are forced into labor for a season or a project. And if they survive, eventually they're returned to their work in their fields or wherever. These draftees were not slaves, but they were part of an underclass that was lacking in social mobility and had no choice in the matter. Qin Shi Huangdi, the emperor of China, used Covey and also convict labor to build the Great Wall. Historians estimate 400,000 people died in its construction. Covey labor for agriculture tended to be demanded by the self-proclaimed nobility at exactly the same time that the peasants needed to attend to their own plots for their survival. Constantine, the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, imposed this system on the empire, and it hung around throughout the Middle Ages. This, along with being tied to the land, became the basis of feudalism in Europe. In Egypt, it existed from ancient times, and after the British took over control of Egypt, they imposed Covey labor to force Egyptians to build the Suez Canal without having to pay them. Throughout history, slavery existed without the upper classes questioning its morality. The Roman poet Martial questioned his sadness at the death of his favorite slaves, but that's all. He missed the slaves, but he didn't think there was anything wrong with having them as slaves. Slaves were property without rights. You could beat a slave, you could kill a slave with no consequence, just like no one condemned you if you smashed a piece of your furniture. You could use a slave, male or female, for sex, and this wasn't considered rape or even adultery. The only example I've seen of a Roman objecting to the treatment of a slave was the Emperor Augustus was dining in a rich man's house as a guest one day. One enslaved man dropped a glass cup. Glass was expensive back then, and the cup broke. The homeowner violently attacked the enslaved man and was about to drown him. Augustus ordered the man to stop. He freed the slave and announced that he wouldn't be visiting this man's home again. The historian Suetonius mentioned this whole incident as just an example of the erratic behavior that the Emperor Augustus sometimes had, and, you know, an example of something strange that the man did. This is a statue of the first person known in history to have denounced slavery as evil. This is Patricius, known today as St. Patrick. Having been abducted as a child and suffered in slavery, then escaped, he well understood enslavement could never be justified. We had to wait until the year 450 before anyone expressed this idea. Eventually, people got the idea that slavery ought to be abolished. And here's some dates for different countries that abolished slavery. Iceland, very early on. Rhode Island, in what would later become the United States, a century before the Revolution, outlawed slavery. Canada, there was a court decree in 1793. France abolished slavery during the French Revolution, 1794. Napoleon got into power, 1802, reimposed slavery. He thought it was a fine idea. And then it was outlawed again in the Revolution of 1848, and this time it actually stuck. Haiti outlawed slavery in 1801 and became the first Black republic in the world that didn't have slavery. The United States in 1804, most of the northern states had abolished slavery. The South didn't until forced to in 1865. And here are some of the other countries. And you notice that Portugal, 1869, several years after the US Civil War. Cuba, 1886. Korea, 1894. Brazil, 1888. And Brazil, by the way, had the greatest number of slaves as a percentage of population in the Americas. China, 1910, with Sun Yat-sen's rebellion. They were trying to ward it off. The empire lasted only a year after this. Ethiopia, 1942, and Mauritania in Western Africa, 2007. Although many countries outlawed slavery, it's still practiced. ISIS revived slavery in 2015 and published on their website what various classes of slaves sell for. West African plantations in the cocoa trade use child slaves today. In Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Mauritania, over 2% of the population are held in slavery today. In America, the Spanish enslaved people almost from the time of their so-called discovery in 1492. The English instituted slavery here in 1619 in Virginia. That was a year before the Mayflower arrived in Plymouth. Slavery initially was found in all the colonies. Ben Franklin founded the first anti-slavery society. After some slave revolts, the planter class in the South imposed slave codes so extreme that a man or a woman kept enslaved could be killed for possessing a book or for knowing how to write. Incidentally, the British came up with this idea in the conquered territory of Ireland a few centuries before that. After the War of Southern Treason, the losers regained control by voter suppression and violence. Any of this sound familiar? Oh, and if anyone ever tells you the Civil War wasn't about slavery, tell them to read the Articles of Succession that the Southern states published for its justification for breaking away from the Union. It was all about slavery. Bringing things closer, the federal minimum wage. And this chart is showing that the minimum wage hasn't kept up with the economy. While many historic modes of undervaluing labor have been abolished, endemic inequality still exists and has increased since the 1980s in the United States. In terms of purchasing power, the minimum wage is less than it was in 1970. The minimum wage hasn't kept up with inflation and has gone in the opposite direction from worker productivity. The majority of Americans have seen the fraction of the national wealth that they hold decline in the last 2 generations. This reverses a century of progress. Tax policy is a major component. Trickle down didn't. Wages have not kept up with productivity either. It is gratifying to see that in times of crisis such as COVID, that everyone is willing to pitch in and share the burden. It is gratifying to see such a thing, but alas, we haven't seen such a thing. Wages are so low at Walmart that employees qualify for food stamps. In effect, taxpayers are subsidizing Walmart to allow them to pay less than a subsistence level wage. And that's my overview of economics over the last 5,000 years. Now is the time for your thoughts on the matter. Mike, if you could lead a discussion, if anybody wants to speak on this issue, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Patrick. And I'm glad to see you've got the minimum wage question